It's a tragic case that intersects mental health and religious interference. Today, we are going to discuss the horrifying case of Andrea Yates and of her own 5 children. This was a case that shocked the nation in 2001. People were so horrified that a mother could do this to her 5 children. At first, it seemed like maybe she was dealing with postpartum. But after more investigation, it became clear that this woman had likely been brainwashed and indoctrinated for years, all under the hands of a creepy, remote cult leader. And today, we are breaking it all down. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hi everyone, welcome back or welcome if you are new. My name is Erin and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I like to share these deep dives with you to help create a deeper understanding of what cult indoctrination looks like and how, even if you're not living in a commune, it can lead to horrifying outcomes. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this story. And if you like learning about things like this, please consider subscribing. I'd love to have you here. So on the morning of June 20th, 2001, Houston police officers arrived at the modest suburban home in Clear Lake, Texas, to a scene of unimaginable horror. Andrea Yates, a 36-year-old mother of 5, greeted them with soaking wet hair and clothing and calmly stated, "I killed my kids." Inside the house, officers found the bodies of Yates's children, 7-year-old Noah, 5-year-old John, 3-year-old Paul, 2-year-old Luke, and 6-month-old Mary. One child was still in the water of the bathtub where they had been drowned, and the others were laid out on a bed under a sheet. There were no signs of struggle. Andrea Yates had methodically drowned each of her children, one by one, during the short window of time after her husband left for work and before her mother-in-law was due to arrive. These poor children had to watch as one by one their mother drowned their siblings in the bathtub. The sheer brutality and sorrow of the act stunned the nation and turned Yates into one of the most hated women in America. In initial interrogations and medical evaluations, Andrea Yates explained with eerie conviction why she did it. She believed that she was saving her children's souls. They were not developing properly, she told detectives.
What were you trying to accomplish then when you did take your children's lives?
Maybe in their innocent years, God would take them up.
God would take them up to be in heaven, is that what you mean? All right. And if you had not taken their lives, what did you think would happen to them?
I guess they would have continued stumbling.
And later she said she felt that Satan was inside her and that her evil influence was dooming her kids to hell. By ending their lives while they were innocent, she thought that she was ensuring that they would go to heaven rather than continue on a path of sin. It was a shocking rationale. A mother killing her children out of a twisted sense of righteousness and salvation. It's really reminding me of Lori Vallow, the woman who literally killed her own children and to this day seems to believe that they are doing well in heaven. It's horrifying. And when it comes to Andrea Yates, it happened very quickly that the public started to learn that she had a severe mental illness, including postpartum psychosis, which did provide a critical lens to try to understand this tragedy. But this case became a grim confrontation in conversations about postpartum mental health and the failings of a system that did not prevent a clearly unwell woman from being left alone with her kids. Even as investigators dug deeper and as Yates's capital Her trial unfolded, another disturbing layer emerged. Andrea Yates' actions didn't form in a vacuum of mental illness alone. They were also shaped by an insular world of extreme religious beliefs and cult influence. Most notably, the fire and brimstone teachings of preacher Michael Warrenecki, whom the Yates family followed unquestioningly. Yates was a deeply religious woman, and in the years leading up to the murder, she had become engrossed with a radical Christian doctrine that preached doom, very strict gender roles, and the notion that unrighteous mothers could condemn their children to hell. So these teachings, combined with Andrea's psychosis, created this perfect storm in her mind. And the result was the unspeakable act that she truly believed at the time was the only way to save her 5 young children from eternal damnation. So in order to try to understand how this horrific act even came to be, we have to try to understand Andrea's mental state the years prior. And by all accounts, Andrea was not an abusive or cruel mother in the ordinary sense. Rather, she was a loving mom that seemed to be overwhelmed by postpartum depression. She even had a history of clinical depression dating back to her teenage years. She also struggled with bulimia and unaliving thoughts in high school. But it was that onset of postpartum depression and psychosis after her children's births that truly pushed her into perilous territory. So Andrea would marry Russell Rusty Yates in 1993, and the couple shared a devout evangelical Christian faith. From the start, they declared that they would welcome as many babies as nature allowed, embracing motherhood as Andrea's calling. And between 1994 and 2000, Andrea gave birth to 5 children in rapid succession. Each childbirth and postpartum period took a heavier toll on her mental health. And after the birth of her 4th child, Luke, in February 1999, Andrea's psyche seemed to begin to unravel. In June 1999, Rusty came home to find Andrea shaking uncontrollably and chewing her fingers in distress, a clear sign of an acute breakdown. The very next day, Andrea attempted to commit unaliving by overdosing on pills. It was a cry for help that could no longer be ignored. So Andrea was hospitalized that month in 1999 and prescribed antidepressant medication. But her depression and psychosis persisted. She became so despondent that at one point, shortly after her release, she held a knife to her throat and begged her husband to let her die. This led to a second hospitalization where she was treated with antipsychotic medication, Haldol, which seemed to improve her condition significantly. And Andrea's doctors would diagnose her with postpartum psychosis, which is a rare but severe psychiatric emergency that can occur after childbirth. Postpartum psychosis often involves hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thinking, and tragically, it carries a significant risk of infanticide or unaliving if untreated. Andrea's psychologist strongly warned the Yateses in 1999 that having another baby could trigger another psychotic episode, perhaps even worse than the last. And in her professional opinion, more pregnancies would, quote, be guaranteeing future psychotic depression for Andrea. But despite this warning, Andrea and Rusty Yates' religious convictions and family plans won out. In the summer of 1999, just 7 weeks after Andrea's discharge from the hospital, 7 weeks, she would become pregnant with their 5th child. And Andrea, perhaps out of concern for the fetus, had stopped taking her medicine in preparation for the pregnancy. And on November 30th, 2000, she gave birth to a baby girl, Mary. And initially, Andrea appeared to cope after Mary's birth. She was doing really well. But within just a few months, the cracks started to reappear. The family suffered a further blow in March 2001 when Andrea's father died, and the loss seemed to destabilize her fragile mental balance. Andrea stopped taking her medication again and began obsessively reading her Bible for hours on end. She even stopped feeding baby Mary properly. She started experiencing those vivid hallucinations and delusions, and among these was the persistent belief that the devil was literally inside her, that she was so sinful or evil that Satan had taken hold of her mind. In late March 2001, Andrea's condition was dire enough to warrant another hospitalization. She came under the care of a different psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, and Andrea was treated and sent home, but within a month, she deteriorated yet again. On May 3, 2001, she relapsed into what was described as a nearly catatonic state. In a particularly haunting moment that month, Andrea drew a bath in the middle of the day for no apparent reason. And later, she would confess that at that time, she'd been contemplating drowning the children. The idea of killing them had been percolating in her troubled mind. But she resisted the impulse that day. Interpreting the filled tub as a possible side of unaliving intent, her doctor would re-hospitalize her in early May 2001. So Andrea was in and out of the hospital for brief stints, and there is evidence that her antipsychotic medication was again discontinued about 2 weeks before the fateful day in June. By June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates was a severely ill woman, psychotic, profoundly depressed, and left unmonitored at the worst possible time. Crucially, at the time of the murder, Rusty was explicitly told that Andrea needed 24/7 supervision. She should not be left alone with the children because of the risk of self-harm or harm to others. Rusty Yates later said he only left his wife alone for an hour that morning because he thought she was doing better, and his mother, who helped care for the kids, was scheduled to arrive very shortly. But it was in that brief 60-minute window that tragedy struck. Andrea, fully in the grip of her delusional mission, systematically drowned all 5 of her beloved children. After ensuring none were alive to, quote, be corrupted, she dialed 911 and requested police without stating why, and then called Russell, telling him to come home immediately. The horrifying deed was done. In the immediate aftermath, public sympathy for Andrea was understandably limited. The crime was so appalling that many could not see past the act itself. But as details of her postpartum psychosis came out, mental health advocates and many in the public began to view her more as a victim of serious illness than a cold-blooded killer. Yates became a central figure in debates about the inadequacy of maternal mental health care. How was it possible, people asked, that a woman with her history had been allowed to reach such a breaking point? Why wasn't there more intervention? And these questions would continue to be asked for years. And Andrea's case would eventually help shift perceptions in the criminal justice system about mental illness. Yet there was another why, a deeper why, that haunted this case. Why did Andrea Yates specifically believe that killing her own children would save them? What doctrine or idea could convince a mother that drowning her children was a righteous, merciful act? But answering that question requires stepping into the twisted world of Michael Warrenecki and the religious, culty environment in which the Yates family lived. Long before the murders, Andrea Yates' life had slowly narrowed into an isolated pressure cooker existence. One that was shaped not only by the demands of caring for 5 young children with little help, but also by the strict confines of fundamentalist religious ideology. Central to that ideology was Michael Peter Warrenecki, an evangelical street preacher whose teachings profoundly influenced Rusty and Andrea Yates. Though Warrenecki was not a nationally known religious leader, those who encountered him often described his influence as cultish and his doctrine as extreme. Michael Warrenecki began preaching in the early 1980s, often appearing on college campuses or public squares with the Bible in one hand and condemnation on his tongue. He was described as tall, muscular, and seemed to be, quote-unquote, gifted with a booming voice, so he would draw crowds of curious people and students with his confrontational style. He loved to prey upon people in college, so that's where he would preach most often. He was targeting those young people who were still trying to find their way in the world. And his messages were not the feel-good sermons of a gentle pastor, but rather apocalyptic fire and brimstone pronouncements. He rallied against the evils of modern society, warning that the end of the world was imminent and that most people, even most self-professed Christians, were bound for hell. To Warnecki, nearly every institution of the secular world was a tool of Satan meant to distract souls from God. Universities, public schools, organized churches, medicine, psychology, all of it, he preached, was part of a corrupt worldly system leading people astray. And only by rejecting these worldly paths and embracing an extremely austere, literal interpretation of biblical living could one hope to be saved. So for many who heard him, Warnecki was really easy to dismiss as a colorful crank shouting about damnation in the campus quad. But to a subset of listeners, especially those already inclined toward fundamentalism, his words struck a chord. And Rusty Yates was one such listener. As a university student at Auburn in the late 1980s, Rusty met Michael Warnecki, who often traveled to preach at those college campuses at the time. Rusty was captivated by the preacher's uncompromising zeal. The two kept in touch, and Rusty became a devoted follower of Warnecki's teachings, so much so that he later introduced these teachings to Andrea when they began dating around 1989. Now, by all accounts, Andrea was not deeply radical or cultic in her faith when she met Rusty. She'd been raised Catholic and then had born-again Christian leanings, but she was described as kind, intelligent, and even somewhat independent in her youth. She'd been a high achiever academically and had a career as a registered nurse before becoming a mom. However, after marrying Rusty and leaving her nursing job to become a stay-at-home mom, Andrea grew increasingly devout and increasingly insular in her faith, but also extremely isolated as she began to homeschool her children. The Yates did not join a mainstream church congregation. Their spiritual life centered on Warnecki's teachings, conducted largely through personal correspondence. This is one of the most unique tactics from a cult I've ever heard of. Michael Warnecki and his wife Rachel operated a sort of traveling home ministry. They would preach in person to those they met on the road, but they also kept up a mailing ministry, literally snail mail. They would send out handwritten letters, pamphlets, newsletters, cassette tapes of sermons, and even homemade VHS tapes dramatizing biblical warnings. In one bizarre series of videos, Warnecki reportedly dressed up as Satan to speak to his followers about the horrors awaiting sinners. And one of the sad details about the Yates murder was that those tapes were playing as Andrea Yates was drowning her children. She was deep into being indoctrinated by these materials. And they would just kind of arrive periodically to the mailbox. It kind of formed this lifeline to the outside world for Andrea, even though it was a dark one. Now, former members of Warnecki's cult have described how the preacher would use these personal letters and tapes to create a sense of fear, dependency, and isolation. Followers often believed that they were one of the few true Christian families remaining righteous in a world teetering on the edge of apocalypse. Importantly, because most of Warnecki's followers only interacted with him remotely via mail, they didn't know how many other people were out there. Each family thought that they were relatively alone in following this path. So this isolation meant that there was little mutual support or reality checking among followers. Each household was basically stewing in its own zealotry. And Rusty and Andrea Yates were exactly the kind of family primed to embrace Warnecki's radical message. They were earnest in their faith, willing to sacrifice creature comforts for spiritual goals, and in Andrea's case, desperately striving to be a godly wife and mother. Michael Warnecki's doctrine gave them a blueprint for living that they attempted to follow to the letter. As one Houston prosecutor later observed, the Yates' home became a cloistered environment, totally cut off from outside influences except for the Warnecki's voice. According to trial testimony, the Yateses believed that institutional churches were corrupt, public schools were evil, and modern pop culture was filled with satanic temptations. They rejected most forms of popular entertainment and secular education. They even distrusted medical interventions to some extent. For instance, the Warnecki tracts taught that women should forego pain medication during childbirth as a godly rite of passage, and indeed, Andrea would deliver all 5 of her babies with no anesthesia or pain relief. considering it to be her biblical duty to suffer. One of the most dramatic lifestyle changes inspired by Warnecki's influence was the Yates family decision to sell their house and live in a converted bus for a time. Warnecki preached an Acts of the Apostles style of living, basically meaning that you're living simply, unencumbered by worldly possessions. He discouraged people from even holding a job because anything outside him and his belief was led by the devil. So why would you work for the devil? Now, sometime after their second child was born, Rusty and Andrea would choose to leave their comfortable suburban home and move into a 350-square-foot GMC motorhome, which was literally a former Greyhound bus, with their growing brood. Now, notably, they actually bought this bus from Michael and Rachel Warnecki themselves in 1997 for $37,000. The bus had religious slogans emblazoned on the exterior and was meant to facilitate a nomadic life of minimalism and devotion. Rusty would testify that he found their sudden simplicity freeing. Quote, "We had a lot of stuff, and it became burdensome." But the reality for Andrea was far harsher. According to her friend, Debbie Holmes, who kept a diary out of concern for Andrea's well-being, the decision to live in the bus was not purely practical or romantic. It stemmed from a conviction that owning a normal house and furniture would make their children materialistic and worldly. So Andrea dutifully gave up her wedding china, her furniture, and all of her personal possessions in the purge. Virtually everything except her sewing machine and her cookware were sold off. And tellingly, Holmes noted, Rusty kept a storage unit for his tools and a few items that he wasn't willing to toss, which highlighted an imbalance to what each spouse would sacrifice. And life in that cramped bus was extremely difficult for Andrea. She was caring for multiple toddlers and pregnant again, all within the confines of a space with no privacy or stability. At night, a pregnant Andrea slept on a makeshift bed on the bus's couch because climbing over the steering wheel to reach the back sleeping quarters was too cumbersome, and she feared disturbing Rusty. This Spartan, stressful living situation lasted for months, and it took a toll on Andrea's physical and mental health. Friends and relatives grew alarmed, and one by one, Andrea's confidants watched as she became more withdrawn, undernourished, and overwhelmed. She stopped engaging in small pleasures and seldom left the bus except to wrangle the children. By 1999, around the time of her fourth child and her first major mental breakdown, Rusty finally agreed to move the family out of the bus and into a small house in an effort to help Andrea's recovery. But by then, really the damage was done. Andrea's sense of self had been utterly subsumed by the twin forces of maternal exhaustion and extreme religious pressure. So what exactly did Michael Warnecki preach that had such a grip on the Yates? At the heart of his teachings, as they related to Andrea, was a terrifying concept. A mother's ultimate responsibility was for the fate of her children's souls. Warnecki's worldview was steeped in apocalyptic urgency and obsession with purity. He often emphasized that the world was full of evil and bound for destruction, and that children, being vulnerable souls, were in constant danger of being lost to sin. The only hope for a child, according to Warnecki, was the righteousness of the parents, especially the mother who is raising them. In his theology, the mother was the gatekeeper who could either raise a saint or, through her failures, raise a lost soul. Some of the key tenets of the Warnecki doctrine that might have since come to light include that all people are hell-bound sinners. Warnecki relentlessly preached that virtually everyone is headed for hell unless they drastically repent and live in total obedience to God, as interpreted only by Warnecki's rigid standards. He even told the Yates family to their faces that they were going to hell. Not as a personal attack, he claimed, but because everybody is going to hell in his view of mankind's depravity. I mean, there were only 8 spots allowed in heaven, and Michael's family, guess how many people were in it? 8. So this blanket condemnation created a climate of fear and guilt among the followers. There was also this thought of the looming apocalypse. This was a major part of Warnecki's message, and it was that Judgment Day was imminent. Former followers recall him saying that God could end the world at any moment, and he would dramatize it by claiming perhaps it was going to happen in 46 minutes or at an unknown but very soon hour. This apocalyptic thinking meant that every action in daily life took on eternal significance. There was no time for worldly pursuits when doom was literally around the corner. He also rejected all worldly institutions, like we mentioned, but I want to dive a little bit deeper into it because he also thought that public schools, colleges, other organized churches, and even hospitals and medicine, all of these things were satanic traps pulling people away from absolute reliance on God. So he urged followers to homeschool their children to avoid satanic influence and to be suspicious of secular knowledge or scientific approaches to problems. And for Andrea, this likely added more pressure because as her mental illness worsened, the notion of turning to psychiatric medicine or secular therapists might have felt like a lack of faith or even a demonic temptation. There were also some really strict gender roles, and there was a heavy emphasis on maternal duty. Men were the spiritual leaders who must utterly dominate their wives in authority, and women were to submit and fulfill their God-ordained role as mothers and homemakers without complaint. Any deviation from this order was seen as rebellion against God. Rachel Warnecki's letters to Andrea reinforced that Andrea's duty was to focus solely on her children's spiritual upbringing and not to expect help or leadership from her husband. She would write, "Don't look to Rusty, look to Jesus." So this suggests that Andrea was counseled to accept her burdens alone and view any struggle as a test of her own faithfulness. Warnecki also pushed this idea that women were all inherently evil witches, so they had to be submissive and put down and talked down to because otherwise all of their evil witchy impulses would come to the surface and they would lead you to damnation. It's abhorrent and crazy. Another key tenet in his teachings that's inherently misogynistic was the rejection of birth control and embrace of suffering. As evidenced by the Yates' own stance on having unlimited children, the community encouraged leaving fertility entirely to God. Motherhood was exalted as a woman's only purpose, but at the same time, any desire for ease or relief was frowned upon. Enduring pain, like that unmedicated childbirth, was taught as a virtue that would humble a mother and align her with God's will. Comfort, rest, or personal fulfillment for the mother was far less important than her sacrificial role. In one of his newsletter poems titled The Perilous Times, which would come up in the trial, he described disobedient, spiritually lost children of a figure named Modern Mother Worldly, and asked rhetorically, what becomes of the children of such a Jezebel? The clear insinuation was that a worldly mother, compared to the evil Jezebel of the Bible, produces corrupted children. And this kind of rhetoric would have been deeply frightening to a devout mother like Andrea, who earnestly wanted to be a godly parent and was already prone to self-criticism. And taking this concept further, Warnecki allegedly taught a doctrine with horrifying implications, that unrighteous mothers create unrighteous children, and it would be better for those children to die before reaching the age of accountability, which is the age of 12, than to continue growing up and go straight to hell. In other words, a child who dies in innocence before they're capable of moral judgment or willful sin in some Christian ideologies would be automatically saved, whereas a child who lives past 12 could choose sin and be damned if their upbringing was not sufficiently holy. This teaching is not part of any mainstream Christian doctrine. It's just a warped twist that Warnecki propagated, perhaps as a way to underscore how high the stakes were for parents to raise their kids right, but for a mentally unstable mother, it could sound like an endorsement of the unthinkable. It's really critical to note that Michael Warnecki denies ever intending for anyone to harm their children, which is honestly just laughable. However, it is his belief system that he instilled that effectively loaded the metaphorical gun and left it on the table of Andrea's mind. She became convinced that she was what Warnecki would term an unrighteous mother, and she would exhibit extreme guilt and feelings of inadequacy about her mothering. She obsessed over normal child misbehavior or developmental delays, seeing them as signs that she was failing God. According to friends' testimony, she worried that her sons were stumbling in faith or becoming too worldly, and if they enjoyed something like a kids' TV show and they weren't instantly obedient, she interpreted that as evidence of spiritual failing. So by the time of the murders, Andrea Yates had spent years living under conditions that, taken together, were truly toxic for her mental stability. Consider what her daily life looked like in the months leading up to June 2001. She was a mother of 5 children, all under the age of 8, a staggering workload in itself, and 2 of those children were still toddlers and 1 an infant, meaning that she was likely up at all hours of the night and day with feeding, changing, and soothing. She was homeschooling the oldest children. She had no outside daycare or regular help aside from occasional visits from her mother-in-law or her friend Debbie. Rusty, working as a NASA engineer, was away from the home most of the day on weekdays. And by some accounts, Rusty expected Andrea to handle all child-rearing tasks in line with their traditional beliefs. He did very little hands-on caregiving. A friend testified that if the children's faces were dirty or if they were hungry, Rusty would simply say, "Wait till your mother comes," rather than address it himself. In effect, Andrea was on duty 24/7. And at the same time, she was dealing with a recurrence of severe mental challenges, hallucinations, delusions, mood swings in which a perfect world would require intensive treatment and rest. But instead, because of their religious beliefs, the Yateses initially sought help through prayer and Christian counseling. They viewed Andrea's depression and psychosis in more of a spiritual framework rather than a clinical one. One therapist who saw Andrea in late 2000 noted that Rusty, during their one joint session, quoted scripture about wives submitting to husbands and showed little acknowledgement of the medical nature of Andrea's condition. The therapist's notes indicated that Andrea felt, quote, overwhelmed and trapped, unquote, with no alternative. An ominous sign that she felt that she had no way out of her situation or her mind's torment. But perhaps the most poignant evidence of Andrea's isolation is the letter that arrived from Rachel Warnecki, Michael's wife, during the height of Andrea's breakdown in early 2001. Andrea had written to Rachel, likely seeking spiritual guidance or comfort, describing her struggles after the baby Mary's birth. And the reply she received was anything but comforting. Rachel's letter acknowledged Andrea's vulnerability, but then laid responsibility squarely on Andrea. Quote, "I know you're frustrated, Andrea. You're accountable for these children. There will be a day when it's too late," unquote. Rachel urged Andrea to stay vigilant in Jesus and essentially warned her that Satan was trying to infiltrate her family. Quote, "If you allow Satan to come in, the consequences will be tragic," unquote. So reading those lines with hindsight is absolutely chilling. It's almost a prophecy of what transpired. For Andrea, already hearing that the devil is inside me from her own fractured mind, such a letter could only confirm her worst fears, and it's coming from her spiritual leader's wife. It told her that her struggle was not just mental illness, it was a cosmic battle for her children's souls, and she personally would be to blame if these souls were lost. Those who have since studied the Yates case argue that this extreme form of religious messaging effectively supercharged Andrea's psychosis. Mental health experts note that psychotic delusions often take on themes that resonate with a person's life and beliefs. For a devout, perfectionist mother like Andrea, the delusion was primed to be religious in nature. Indeed, postpartum psychosis frequently involves religious or altruistic hallucinations. Mothers in such states may believe that they're receiving commands from God, or that by killing their children, they're sending them to heaven or protecting them from some satanic evil. In Andrea's case, the content of her hallucinations and delusions matched the apocalyptic and satanic imagery that Warnecki was feeding her. She believed the devil was literally in her home and in her, and that her influence was corrupting her otherwise innocent kids. She likely saw ordinary childhood misbehavior as evidence of demonic infection or her failure to be godly enough. Every time a child cried or acted out, it may have struck her as a sign that she was a bad mom, leading them to sin. In the Yates household, there was virtually no counterbalance to these dark beliefs. Rusty, while perhaps not as inwardly troubled as Andrea, ardently believed in Warrenecki's framework. He would later maintain that their involvement with Warrenecki was being exaggerated by the media, yet court testimony and his own admissions showed that he introduced Andrea to the preacher's tapes and corresponded regularly with him and even visited them in person. During one visit in 1998, Michael Warrenecki directly confronted Rusty and Andrea, telling them that they were bound for hell and needed to repent. And rather than run from such harsh judgment, the Yateses seemed to have taken it as a challenge to prove their devotion. So they doubled down on their piety, with Andrea in particular striving desperately to be the perfect Proverbs 31 woman, the biblically idealized wife and mother. All this time, warning signs of Andrea's mental collapse continued to wave like red flags. Friends like Debbie Holmes have said that they practically begged Rusty to lighten the load on Andrea to get her more help or to just supervise her more closely when she was ill. Holmes even kept a diary for 2 years to note Andrea's decline because she was afraid something bad would happen. And tragically, those fears were realized. In a heart-wrenching anecdote, Holmes recalled calling Rusty in tears one weekend in early 2001, pleading that Andrea needed immediate help. She's not going to make it through the weekend, she warned him. And Rusty did take back to the hospital that time, but each hospital stay she had was brief and ultimately insufficient. And by June 2001, the letters from the Warreneckis were arguably more influential to Andrea than any doctor's advice. In one chilling detail revealed later, Andrea listened to Michael Warrenecki's sermon tapes on the very morning of those murders. It appears that she might have played one of his recorded rants as she prepared to murder her children. We can only imagine what was on that tape. Likely warnings of God's wrath and the need to sacrifice everything for salvation, or that her children were nearing the age where they would begin to sin, and why would you put them through a life of sin only for them to end up in hell? Warrenecki's words were extreme, and to Andrea's psychotic mind, they might have sounded like direct instructions or divine confirmation. When Andrea was committing the act, she, in her mind, was performing an act of salvation. She later explained that she had to drown them before they grew up anymore and strayed from God. The older ones were already too worldly in her eyes. 7-year-old Noah loved books and maybe TV, which Andrea might have seen as distractions from faith. As she told her psychiatrist, the children could never be saved the way she was raising them. So she thought to save them in the only way she believed was left: send them to God as innocents and remove herself, the bad influence, from their lives. Andrea even thought that by being executed for murder, because Texas was seeking the death penalty for her initially, that she would be punished and prevented from having more children that she might ruin. It's just really harrowing to think about living in that mindset. Andrea literally saw the act of drowning her children as a last sacrificial act of motherly love that had been twisted by delusion. So in 2002, the jury would find Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder, and she would be sentenced to life in prison. However, in 2005, her conviction was overturned on appeal due to a really weird twist. It emerged that Dr. Dietz had given false testimony. Dietz, who had spoken at the trial as an expert witness, claimed that shortly before the murders, an episode of the TV show Law & Order aired in which a mother drowned her kids and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. So this was meant to suggest that Andrea might have crafted her defense based on a television plot. But guess what? That episode never existed. So the court ruled that this false testimony could have improperly influenced the jury, and so Andrea was entitled to a new trial. And this time, the influence of Warrenecki was much more clearly described, even though Warrenecki himself was never held accountable for any of his indoctrination. But the jury in the second trial would find Andrea Yates not guilty by reason of insanity. And after 3 days of deliberation, they concluded that her mental illness had indeed stripped her of the capacity to discern right from wrong at the time of the killings. Now, Andrea was not set free. She was committed indefinitely to a state mental hospital, but the verdict was a huge shift in legal acknowledgement of her condition. As someone from the outside looking in, it is really hard to reconcile that someone would ever murder their children. I think we saw this with the Lori Vallow case a lot. But Lori Vallow was really off-putting, and she maintained that what she was doing was correct. She maintains that she did the right thing for her children, whereas Andrea Yates does admit to being in a poor mental state, and she admits wrongdoing on a certain level. Now, it is so challenging to prove that someone can be so influenced by religion and religious doctrine or otherwise indoctrinated to do certain acts. And Michael Warnecki has continued to maintain that he had no intention of anyone ever harming their children. And it's difficult because no legal system can easily assign blame to a preacher for the actions of a follower unless there was a direct incitement of violence. Warnecki claims that he was just sharing Jesus with the family, and he says that any claims that his teachings caused the murders are ridiculous and just a media fabrication, even though we can see the pamphlets he sent and we can hear the recordings he made. He points out that he never told anyone explicitly to harm children, and most of his followers didn't do such acts. But Andrea Yates isn't every other person. The things that we say when we're not clear about them have an impact on people. And people do horrible, horrible things if they're indoctrinated in the right way. This is not only a clear example of how you don't have to be in person to be a part of a cult or to be influenced in the worst way by somebody. I mean, it's the content we watch. It's the religious leaders we see. It's every spiritual influencer who's just trying to sell you a course. They're all the same, but they're not all going to lead to a tragedy of this magnitude. But this one did, and it needs to be an example of just how far someone who's been indoctrinated, who is also struggling with mental health challenges, just how far they can go. It feels unthinkable, but postpartum depression and psychosis is real, and coupled with extreme religious beliefs, I can only imagine the mental gymnastics someone in Andrea's position was going through. It does not justify what she did. Do not get me wrong there. It's a horrific thing to do to children. It's horrific. And this needs to be an example of just how fragile the human mind really can be. Because at the end of the day, the question still lingers. Would this tragedy have occurred if Michael Warnecki had never entered the Yates' lives? And there's really no clear answer. But it is telling that both the defense and the prosecution in 2002 referenced Warnecki's influence and essentially agreed that it played some role. They just differed on what role it was legally. And in 2006, the renewed focus on the cultic influence arguably helped tip the balance towards recognizing the depths of Andrea's insanity. The cult aspect was not exactly a secret, but it was initially overshadowed by the mental health narrative. Over time, however, it became clear that to fully explain all of this, we have to examine the potent combination of mindset and mental state, the beliefs, and the biology. Like I said in my intro, this story sits at the crossroads of two things that are often misunderstood: severe mental illness and religious extremism. And either one alone can lead to tragedy, but together they created a uniquely devastating outcome. Psychologists and sociologists alike have long studied how cultic or extremist beliefs can influence behavior. In many documented cases, perfectly sane individuals, under the sway of a charismatic leader or an all-encompassing ideology, have carried out acts of violence or self-destruction they likely never would have considered on their own. I mean, the Jonestown Massacre comes to mind. Consider those recent cases like Lori Vallow, who was influenced by her doomsday religious beliefs. These aren't cases necessarily of clinically insane individuals, but they illustrate how a radical belief system can create a shared psychosis or alternate reality among followers. Andrea Yates' situation is somewhat different in that she had documented medical psychosis and was steeped in extreme beliefs. To parse out the contributions of each is a little tricky. It's akin to asking what makes a fire spread, the spark or the gasoline. The answer's both. The postpartum psychosis was the spark, but the religious extremism was the gasoline that fueled the content of her delusions and drove her to a specific kind of act. From a psychiatric perspective, Andrea's delusions fall into a category known as religious delusions, which are common in psychotic disorders for individuals who have strong faith backgrounds. In postpartum psychosis, a significant number of women experience delusions that are religious in nature. One study indicates many women with postpartum psychosis have hallucinations or delusional beliefs specifically about their infant's fate or their role in God's plan. It is not unusual for a mother in psychosis to believe, for example, that God is commanding her to sacrifice her children as a test of faith, or conversely, that the devil is trying to take her child and she must save the child, even if saving them means that they are paradoxically killing them to send them to heaven. These are absolutely horrific distortions of maternal protective instincts, but they're all being filtered through a psychotic lens. And what exacerbates things even more is when the environment around this person reinforces aspects of the delusion instead of counteracting it. In Andrea's case, virtually every external voice she respected, apart from medical professionals whom she probably distrusted, they were all telling her that Satan and hell were real and immediate threats, and that her job was to ensure her kid's salvation at all costs. When she voiced, "I feel like Satan is in me," or "the children aren't obeying God," instead of someone firmly grounding her in reality and saying, "No, Andrea, you're a great mother, you're doing your best, your children are normal and healthy, you just need some treatment for your mind, you need a break," she instead received so much validation in the form of religious platitudes. Yes, the enemy is always trying to attack, pray harder, guard your kids from the world. It's not that anyone had to say explicitly, "Go kill your children." Of course not. But the lack of a moderating perspective and the constant drumbeat of fear can create a feedback loop that takes a person from troubled to absolutely unhinged. Historically, devout individuals experiencing psychosis often interpret their hallucinations as religious visions or commands. So now that we know all of this, what is going on with Andrea Yates today? Well, she still lives in a mental health facility in Kerrville, Texas. She's in her early 60s and she's been institutionalized for nearly half her life. By all accounts, with medication and therapy, she has long since stabilized and gained insight to what happened. She's described as a quiet, helpful patient who occupies her time with simple pursuits like knitting and taking care of the facility's plants, and who always remembers her children's birthdays. Andrea never has sought to be released, even though periodically there are hearings where she could argue for a pass or transition to outpatient care. She apparently feels she deserves to remain where she is, and perhaps fears life on the outside. And Rusty Yates, who stood by Andrea throughout the trials, eventually divorced her in 2005, as he couldn't realistically continue the marriage. But he did not abandon her completely. In fact, Rusty reportedly still visits her in the hospital, even decades later. He did remarry for a time and had another child, but that marriage ended in divorce in part because Rusty's life remained tied to Andrea in a profound way. He's expressed that he forgives her and that he understands the killings were the result of mental illness. Over the years, Rusty has also participated in efforts to raise awareness about postpartum disorders and has never wavered in saying that Andrea would never have harmed their children had she been of sound mind. Now, as for Michael Warrenecki, he continues to preach across the United States. Yep, he and Rachel, along with their own 6 grown adult children, still travel and evangelize, often visiting college campuses like they did in the past. Warrenecki insists he's not a cult leader, but simply a passionate bearer of the gospel. On his personal website and blog, he's periodically responded to the Andrea Yates case to try to defend himself. He claims that people have slandered him with terrible lies and fabricated stories regarding his involvement. Bro, you sent cassettes and videotapes of yourself to your followers. Give me a break. It's honestly so frustrating that he's still traveling around and going to college campuses. Like, something should be done about that. Now that we've gotten to the end of this saga, it's worth taking a moment to remember the victims: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary Yates. The 5 beautiful young children whose lives were cut tragically short. In focusing on Andrea's psyche and influences, we cannot lose sight that their loss is the real tragedy. Russell Yates, who has somehow carried on, visits their graves, and he has said that he finds peace knowing that they are in heaven, the very fate Andrea had wanted for them. The bitter irony is that Andrea's worst fear, that her kids might go to hell, was unfounded. Those children were loved, and even had they grown up in a less than perfect way, like all kids do, no sane mother would ever think they were destined for perdition. The final lesson, perhaps, is that extremist fear-based religion robbed an entire family of its future. Thank you all for watching today. I know this was such a difficult one to get through. Really, really heartbreaking. I'm really eager to hear your point of view. I'm curious if you've watched the recent HBO series, Andrea Yates, The Cult Behind the Killer. That's what inspired this video. And if you feel inclined or like it might help you or somebody else and you want to share about your experience with postpartum depression, if you feel like you'd like to, obviously don't if it doesn't feel like a safe space for you to do that. I'd be really interested in hearing firsthand accounts, and I'm sure a lot of the other viewers would. So if you're comfortable, I do invite you to share. And otherwise, please be safe out there. Remember to ask questions and always stay skeptical. And I will see you in my next video very soon. Thanks again for being here. Bye.